What is the scariest thing that has ever happened to you that still haunts you? Story 1. When I was about 5 or 6, our stove caught on fire when my parents left a pan unattended while they were making French fries or something else that required a good amount of oil. And by the time anyone noticed, the kitchen was basically destroyed and everything spiraled into chaos. My dad bolted straight out the back door, and me being little, I tried to follow him, crawling on my hands and knees like we had been taught in school. My mom grabbed the pan that was on fire and tried to run to throw it outside where my dad was holding the door open. But she did not see me on the floor and tripped, spilling the fire and hot oil all over me. If it had not been for my hands covering my head and taking the brunt of the flames, I would not have survived, as I ended up with third-degree burns all over my hands, arms, feet, and head. The doctors later found a hole burned all the way through to my skull and were not sure how nothing worse had happened. The worst part of the entire experience was my hands, because the first hospital we went to made a mistake in how they treated them and ended up causing nerve damage in both. I remember trying to tell them something was wrong and that it hurt too much. But of course, no one believed a newly traumatized child knew better than trained medical professionals. After 5 hospital transfers, months of physical therapy, and countless bandages later, I was left with severe scars, a bald spot on my head where scar tissue prevents hair from ever growing back, and a debilitating fear of anything hot. No matter how many psychological techniques I try, I am still incredibly anxious around fire. No matter how small or controlled, and even lighters or curling irons can send me into full panic attacks. Story 2. I am from Chechnya and have witnessed more than a few bombings and shootouts in my life as a result of the insurgency there, but the scariest incident happened when I was about 9 or 10 years old. My father and I lived in a village in the mountains that was a major hotspot of the insurgency against Russia up until a few years ago, and raids by the Russian Federal Security Service were fairly common. One day I was walking home from school with some friends when suddenly we heard extremely loud explosions coming from nearby side streets, and around 20 of us scattered in all directions. My friend Cosmat and I hid in a back alley for a few minutes, trying to stay low because the gunfire sounded like it was coming from everywhere, and we were too scared to move. After about 3 minutes, a young man came running around the corner holding a rifle, looking maybe 18 to 20 years old, with long dark brown hair and a patchy beard that had not fully grown in, and I clearly remember he was wearing a gray Puma hoodie. He was limping badly, either from being shot or hit by shrapnel in the leg, and there was a lot of blood. We were behind a concrete wall, and he fired a few rounds toward whoever was on the other side before running out of ammunition. And while trying to reload, he noticed us and yelled at us to run and get out of there, though my memory of his exact words is blurry. Of course, being children, we were terrified and completely froze. His weapon then jammed or malfunctioned, and he became extremely angry, crying and hitting it in frustration. Moments later, on the other side of the wall, a man wearing a ski mask and heavy armor from the Russian Federal Security Service appeared, made a hand gesture telling us to stay low, and then shot the other man in the throat, causing him to collapse and make disturbing sounds before dying. Cosmat and I were hysterical at that point, overwhelmed by the noise and convinced we were about to die. Several more security officers arrived, fired additional shots into the body, and began stripping it while making jokes and crude comments about taking souvenirs, completely ignoring us until one of them, who I believe was the one who fired the first shot, walked over, told us to stop crying, and said we should go home. He even patted us on the back and said something along the lines of being sorry we had seen that, and that we did well, and then we slowly got up and left. I am not constantly haunted by the experience and have not been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, but it is easily the scariest thing that has ever happened to me, even compared to being near a Suic bombing that killed 8 people, and I still think about it sometimes. Story 3. Mine happened 8 years ago and involved me and my best friend of 23 years. My friend had developed a personality disorder due to extensive childhood abuse, and a couple of months earlier, we had both been in a car accident where our mutual friend passed away. So naturally, we were both deeply depressed. She had no idea what was happening to her mentally, and combined with the depression, it was not mixing well at all. We were staying in a high-rise hotel for a party that was not too far away, and she left a bit earlier than I did, only about 30 minutes before me. Everything seemed completely normal from what I can remember. I was drunk and casually walked into her room to talk to her in my intoxicated haze, and she was standing on the window balcony when she suddenly jumped. I somehow managed to cross the room in an instant and caught her with one hand, despite having almost no upper body strength. I remember shaking uncontrollably from adrenaline and having heart palpitations for about 24 hours afterward. We are still best friends. She is doing much better now and is not suicidal. And in fact, that was the only suicidal act she has ever attempted. She is still dealing with the disorder, but it is very manageable now. And although it was extremely difficult at the beginning, she managed to get through university. I will remember that moment for the rest of my life, and the car crash itself would be the second scariest thing I have ever experienced, because I still do not understand how three of us survived, and the sight of it made me wish I had been knocked unconscious. Story 4. My dentist made a serious mistake when giving me laughing gas, also known as nitrous oxide, and gave me far too much far too quickly. The nitrous tank he was using was brand new, and I later overheard the assistants talking about how he had not adjusted the strength for the pressure difference between a full tank and the old one. He left me alone with the gas running for about 10 minutes, and as a 10-year-old child, I did not realize that the loopy feeling I was experiencing had become abnormal until I started seeing white spots and felt like I was about to pass out. I began panicking, and the dentist and two assistants rushed in, also panicking. I could not see properly. I was losing consciousness. I felt like I was going to throw up. I had chills, and overall, I felt like I was dying. The dentist gave me a few breaths of pure oxygen to help, which made me feel incredibly heavy, but more alert and less like I was fading away. The assistants were calling out different things, and I distinctly remember one of them offering me the Pepsi she had brought for lunch, which struck me as strange considering we were in a dental office and soda is terrible for teeth. Eventually, I felt grounded enough to rush to the bathroom, where I vomited and shook for several minutes alone. I still went through with the filling that day, but without any laughing gas at all, using only local anesthetic. When I told my mom this story recently, she told me the dentist had claimed I simply had a panic attack and that nothing had actually gone wrong, which still makes me angry, knowing he likely covered up his mistake by blaming my anxiety. My mom agrees with me and remembers how badly that day affected me. But since it happened 8 years ago and there is no evidence, nothing can be done about the malpractice. Since then, I have been much more wary of dentists, and I can no longer use nitrous oxide without feeling nauseous. Story 5. This happened to me just this past summer, on my birthday of all days. I was with some friends watching a World Cup game on a large outdoor screen, just relaxing, drinking, and enjoying the sunshine. Behind the screen, there was a large multi-story parking structure, separated from the viewing area by a narrow-walled alleyway. Out of nowhere, something caught my eye on the roof of the parking structure, where a man was standing on the ledge. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could say a word, he jumped. He landed in the alleyway, and I will never forget the sound of his body hitting the ground. A few of us instinctively ran toward him, foolishly hoping that maybe he had survived and needed help, but he did not survive. When we reached him, his head and face were severely damaged, and there was visible brain matter on the ground. His bones were shattered, with some protruding from his body, and I had never seen injuries like that before, and was completely unprepared for it. For a long time, and even now, I think about whether in his darkest moment, he ever realized that dozens of strangers were only a short distance away, people who would have gladly helped him and stayed with him through the night, and that I would have done almost anything to pull him out of that despair. For a while, I grieved deeply for a tormented man I encountered just moments too late. Story 6. It might sound tame, but once a guy saw me get off the bus and then showed up at my stop for 4 days in a row at 11:30 at night to wait until I got off and talk to me. He immediately started talking about how attractive I was, so I panicked and told him a friend was waiting for me, hoping he would not do anything if he thought someone else was there. He became extremely angry, aggressively wrote his phone number down, handed it to me, and told me I had to text him. He then started following me, rambling about random things, and at that point I was terrified. I told him he could go to his house, but he said he would rather do his evening walk with me. I must have repeated that I was fine alone and that he could go home 5 times in a row, and he still followed me. He finally let me go once I got into my driveway. The next day, I called the bus service and the police, and the woman who drove the evening route said she had seen a man waiting 6 or 7 times in the middle of the road around 11:30 at night, which is when I had started taking an earlier stop. The police told me the number he gave me was fake, and once they got confirmation from the bus driver, they opened criminal harassment charges. The next time he showed up, the police parked directly in front of him, and he ran away into a nearby park. That is a very shortened version of what happened, but now I never walk alone without some form of protection, and I will never know whether that man was intoxicated, mentally unwell, or genuinely dangerous. Story 7. Last year's earthquake was the scariest experience of my life. I was on my way to work on a bus when the shaking started, and at first I thought it was something else because the alarms were not sounding. But then people began to panic, and the bus had to stop. It was an extremely intense earthquake, and then there was a loud crashing sound as the building in front of the bus began to collapse, filling the air with dust and water. I was convinced the building was going to fall onto the bus and that I was going to die. People were screaming, the bus sped to the next stop, and we all got out. My legs were shaking, and I was certain the entire city was being destroyed. The worst part came afterward, when I could not communicate with my family to know if they were safe. Public transportation stopped working due to the damage, so I had to walk home along with many other people. There was a fire nearby and smoke in the air, and most of us were walking on autopilot while trying to use our phones, but the connections kept failing. After what felt like hours, I finally received a call from my mother saying she and my brother were fine, but they had no information about my father and could not reach him. A couple of hours later, I arrived home, desperately hoping my father would be there, but he was not. My mother was crying and calling him nonstop. My aunts were calling us, asking if we knew anything, and no one had answers. I was more anxious than I had ever been in my life, crying while watching the news and seeing collapsed buildings, people who had died, and others still trapped. When my father finally came home, we hugged and cried together, and he told us he had also walked the entire way without knowing if we were alive. The next day there was another earthquake, and when the alarm sounded, I fainted. Even now, a year later, I am still terrified of another one happening. Story 8. I have told this story before, but my mother tried to kill my little brother and me, nearly bleeding him to death and leaving him permanently injured. I was 16 and my brother was 14, and our mother was a nurse who had always been abusive, hitting, kicking, slapping us, and sometimes forcing us to sleep in the garage. She had divorced our father, who later took his own life, and we were left alone with her. I once tried to contact Child Protective Services, but the first thing they did was call her, and the punishment I received afterward was so severe that I learned never to trust the system again. She later met a wealthy man from another country, and suddenly we were seen as obstacles preventing her from starting a new life. The verbal abuse became constant, but my brother and I stayed united, so she changed her plan. One morning, she substance-aged our breakfast juice, and when my brother became drowsy, she cut his femoral vein. I will never stop being grateful that she missed the artery, because otherwise he would not have survived. I had not finished my juice due to stomach issues, and I somehow managed to drag my brother into the bathroom, lock the door, scream for help through the window, apply pressure to his wound, and beg him to stay awake. When the police and emergency services arrived, she claimed through fake tears that I had attacked my brother and then myself, locking us in the bathroom. I was dragged out in handcuffs covered in blood, hysterical and incoherent due to adrenaline and the substances in my system, while my brother was rushed into surgery. I spent 6 hours in an adult jail cell until my brother reminded the doctors what had happened and asked for me when he woke up. She had also nicked my neck, but I managed to avoid serious injury. In the end, she served only 24 months in prison after claiming temporary insanity. Story 9. My apartment was broken into while I was home and asleep in bed, and by the time I was registering what was happening, the intruder was already in my bedroom. He knocked my bedroom door open just as I was starting to get up, and halfway through the motion of getting out of bed, he pulled a gun and started screaming at me not to move. I immediately put my hands on my head and lay back down. The next moments could not have been more than 10 or 15 seconds. But lying there waiting for the sound of the gun and what I believed would be the end of my life felt like an eternity. I was certain I was not going to see another day, and that this was how I was going to die, shot in my own bed. I then heard another loud crash and stayed frozen, and only after hearing him running did I look up. Realizing he was leaving, I jumped out of bed and ran out of my apartment, trying to see where he was going or what vehicle he might be getting into. There are details I will not go into because they are not relevant to the scariest part of the experience, and it was not the gun or even the certainty of my own death. The most terrifying realization was that I was getting out of that bed with the intention of killing someone. I was prepared to wrap my hands around his neck and not stop. In that moment, I made a conscious decision that I was willing to end a life, and I know that realization will stay with me for the rest of my life. Story 10. This is going to sound like a joke, but it genuinely terrified me. He-Man used to be one of my favorite heroes, and when I was in kindergarten, I even insisted on wearing my suspenders in an X shape to imitate Prince Adam's style. That all changed one evening when I was given a battery-operated replica of He-Man's sword, which had several buttons that played sounds and made the blade light up, along with a feature that caused it to clang and flash whenever you hit something with it. What I did not know at the time was that the sword had a disturbing flaw. To turn it off, the blade had to go through a powering down sequence, and if the batteries were low, it could get stuck halfway through, leaving it glowing faintly and emitting a deep, creaking growl. Because it also tried to shut itself off automatically after a few minutes, it became the perfect device for terrifying a child trying to fall asleep. One night after playing with it, my mother sent me to bed, and I placed the sword in the corner of my room, turned off the light, and crawled under the covers. That was when I heard it, a low, ominous moan paired with a sickly yellow glow. I sat straight up in bed and stared at the sword flickering in the darkness, its sound feeling like a promise of something terrible. I ran from my room screaming for my parents, and my father, who had just gotten home, tried to calm me down and remove the batteries from the toy. The fear only intensified when the sword continued to glow and growl for a few moments, even after the batteries were out. After that night, I never looked at He-Man the same way again. Story 11. When I was a child, it was clear to most of my family that my father struggled with bipolar disorder, and my mother usually took the brunt of his episodes until one day she decided she could no longer live that way. They divorced when I was 10 years old, and the following year my father fell into a severe depression. He was already a heavy drinker, but somehow managed to drink even more. One night my parents were arguing over the phone, and since my mother's room was right next to mine, I could hear her crying and yelling, though I do not remember exactly what was said. I fell asleep that night and had one of the most horrific nightmares I have ever experienced, where I clearly saw my father hanging from the rafters in the garage of the home he was living in. The next day I went to school like normal, until halfway through the morning, when my principal pulled me out of class and told me to feel better, which confused me because I was not sick. That was when I learned that the nightmare I had the night before had come true. My mother did not tell me the exact cause of his death until 3 or 4 years later, when I was 15, but deep down I had always known. Even now, about 7 years later, I still experience night terrors and struggle with sleep, constantly afraid that I will dream of losing someone else I love. Story 12. My scariest experience was my significant other's Suix in late 2015. We had dated for about a month. I realized how unhealthy the situation was. I broke up with him, and he ended his life in retaliation. I was on the phone with him when it happened. I struggle with post-traumatic stress because who does something like that? Who uses their death to hurt another person so deeply? I know he was scared and in pain, but it was the single cruelest thing anyone has ever done to me. He called me right before it happened, told me it was my fault and that he loved me, and I know now that it was meant to hurt me. I wish he could have seen a better way forward, but even with hindsight, I can analyze my own mistakes endlessly and never find peace there. I get angry sometimes that he will never have to live with the self-loathing or the pain his death caused so many people who loved him. Angry that he will never have to face grieving parents who had just sent their brilliant firstborn child off to school months earlier. and angry that his two younger siblings are growing up without their older brother. This is my scariest story because I am terrified of anything like that ever happening again, and it feels like it would destroy me. My relationships have suffered because it feels like if I make a mistake, people I care about will die. I have a strong mental health care team that has helped me immensely. I finally stopped numbing these feelings with alcohol, and I have forgiven him and grown a lot in the 3 years since. But healing from trauma is not linear. This time of year is especially hard because it is when we grew close and started dating, and Thanksgiving always brings back memories of trying to cope while surrounded by family who would not even acknowledge his death because he was transgender. Story 13. I lived in an apartment that was part of a 2-story house with a small unit on the top floor, and it had improper heating with a trailer-style heater and incorrect ventilation, which meant carbon monoxide was pouring into the apartment. My wife and I always loved sleeping with the window cracked open for cold winter air, which may have saved our lives repeatedly during the 3 months we lived there. One night with extremely high winds, I slept on the couch only a few feet away from the heater, and when my wife came home, she could not wake me up at all. It took her physically shaking and hitting me to get any response, and she managed to get me out of the apartment before calling the gas company that night for a possible leak. They discovered the duct system had been installed incorrectly, and that the apartment was filled with carbon monoxide at levels that should have killed me, and likely would have if my wife had not come home early, and should have killed us many times over if not for the windows being open. The gas company employee reportedly went off on the homeowner who lived downstairs, and we moved out shortly after. There was no fight over the lease, and we got everything back, likely because they were just relieved we were not going to take legal action. Story 14. The armored unit I was in was assigned to guard a bridge on the night a large convoy of trucks carrying jet fuel was moving from Camp Carroll to Khe Sanh along Route 9 in 1971 in Quang Tri Province. I was part of the ground radar team guarding the bridge and had 3 one-hour watches scheduled, so I went to sleep early. 2 soldiers from a personnel carrier dismounted a machine gun and set it up in a shallow ditch about 8 or 9 inches deep, roughly 40 feet in front of the tank on our end of the bridge. And being the inexperienced new guy I was, I rolled out my sleeping bag next to the machine gun and passed out from exhaustion, expecting to be woken up in a couple of hours. I was not. I woke up about an hour later lying on my back, seeing green tracer rounds coming toward me and red tracer rounds heading toward the hill in front of me, realizing I was in the middle of a firefight, alone in a ditch. The soldiers manning the machine gun had run back to their vehicle at the first shot and left me there sleeping. Still half asleep, I rolled onto my stomach toward the gun, which immediately drew attention from 6 or 8 enemy soldiers who opened fire on me. For roughly 10 minutes, I was shot at by a machine gun team on the hill, several rifles, and had 3 rocket-propelled grenades fired in my direction. The firing would last 10 or 15 seconds, then shift toward the fuel trucks and the tanks, and this happened 5 or 6 times. I lay there listening to bullets strike beside me, in front of me, and behind me, absolutely terrified, praying to anyone I could think of. To this day, I cannot explain how I survived that ambush. When fire from our vehicles finally drove the enemy off the hill, my sergeant ordered me to crawl back to him behind the lead tank, and I initially refused. He then ordered the vehicles to give me covering fire, and I finally gathered the courage to crawl on my hands and knees back to him. He made me remove my shirt and pants to check for wounds or blood, and there was nothing. He could not believe it, then proceeded to give me the worst verbal reprimand I have ever experienced. After my tour ended and I left the Army, the nightmares began, and for years I woke up yelling, swinging my arms and drenched in sweat. Thankfully, I have not had any obvious post-traumatic symptoms for over 40 years. Story 15. Last summer, my wife and I, along with our best friends who were another married couple, decided to go tubing down our local river, the same river where the kayaking events of the 1996 Summer Olympics were held, though the intense whitewater section was far upriver from where we planned to float, which was usually calm. I had bought 2 double tubes, one for us and one for our friends, and we tied them together with a rope so we would not drift apart. For about 4 hours, we floated, talked, laughed, and enjoyed the day. As we approached our ending point at a rarely used boat ramp, We all jumped out of the tubes thinking we would simply walk up the ramp, but the water speed suddenly increased and swept us away. My wife and one of our friends slammed into the bank and managed to grab roots and vegetation, while his wife stayed attached to the tube and was carried into calmer water where she could stand up and get out. I was not so lucky, as the rope wrapped around my waist several times and then around a tree stump, and the current repeatedly pushed water over my face. I could only dig my fingertips into the tree bark to keep my head above water. After the women were safe, my friend let go of the bank, grabbed the stump I was trapped on, and freed me, saving my life at serious risk to his own. We all walked away with a completely new respect for water and nature. The most disturbing part was that a family was standing on the boat ramp, watching everything happen, and instead of helping, they simply left. And later we saw them upriver, packing up their things as quickly as possible. Story 16. In 1983, I was working at the Buffalo Bill Boy Scout Camp, about 6 miles east of the East Gate to Yellowstone National Park, and I had been allowed to bring my cat for the summer, which he absolutely loved. The senior counselors lived in an 80-year-old log cabin while everyone else stayed in tents, and our trash cans were kept around the corner from the front door, where there was no light at all. For an entire week, every morning I had to clean up trash because my cat was getting into it at night and making a huge mess. One Saturday night, my only night off, I went outside to get on my motorcycle when I heard my cat in the trash again, so I started yelling at him, which he completely ignored. I yelled that I was going to come over and beat his butt, went back inside the cabin, and grabbed a flashlight so I could catch and spank him. When I rounded the corner toward the trash can and turned on the light, the beam was instantly filled with the head of the largest grizzly bear I have ever seen, and he was very much a wild animal. The bear just stared at me. The bear safety training I had received told me not to run, which goes completely against the natural fight-or-flight response. And at that moment, I experienced what I can only describe as the biggest adrenaline surge of my life. In a single stride, I was on the front porch. 2 more strides, and I was on top of the dining table inside the cabin, screaming that there was a bear. We eventually managed to scare the bear away by firing shots over his head. When I went back outside to find my cat, I realized he had been calmly watching the entire thing from the roof of the cabin, and I can only imagine what he must have been thinking. Staring death in the face that night gave me a deep understanding of how powerful and unpredictable human instinct really is. Story 17. I was in the middle of getting a root canal when I started to feel more than I should have. Though at first it was not bad enough to ask for more anesthetic, my jaw was already in severe pain because it is permanently dislocated, and the only thing they could do was let me pop it back into place every 30 minutes, which I thought was the worst part of the experience. Then they started drilling my tooth, and suddenly I felt a sharp, electric pain shoot through my eye and the left side of my face. I started shaking my head and saying no, but I had a dental device in my mouth that prevented me from speaking. The pain kept intensifying, and the dentist and her assistant began to panic because they needed more anesthetic and could not immediately find it. I started thrashing in the chair, shaking and crying because the pain was unbearable, and I could not speak or move my mouth due to the protective device covering my exposed tooth. All I could do was cry and use my hands to try to communicate what was wrong. Eventually, they numbed me again and used so much anesthetic that almost my entire face went numb, but I was still crying because I was alone. Both of my parents were out of town, and I was terrified and just wanted them there. After they finally finished the procedure, they told me that my canal was extremely thin and had broken during drilling, which exposed everything beyond the tooth and caused the intense pain. I was still upset because the situation had been handled poorly and left me far more frightened than necessary. I did not want to worry my parents since they already felt guilty for not being able to be there that day, so I waited until they got home to tell them what had happened. I ended up spending the rest of the day passed out on the couch, completely exhausted from crying and from the excessive amount of local anesthetic. But on the bright side, my little brother came over with a lot of food, stayed the night, and we played video games together until late, which meant more to me than he probably realized. Story 18. My grandmother was bipolar and an alcoholic, which was a terrible combination, and she would go through cycles of taking her medication and then deciding she was fine and stopping. She was abusive. My mother had a very difficult childhood, And despite everything, she was still living with us at the time. I was an angsty child, and one day my grandmother and I were arguing over something I cannot even remember anymore. And I made a comment while walking from the hallway into the living room. At the same moment, my brother was coming down the hallway, and she thought he was the one who had said it. She grabbed him by the throat, pinned him against the wall, and hit him. It was not enough to make him lose consciousness, and I do not think his neck even bruised, but it was terrifying. She eventually let go, and he called the police. She told me and my two younger brothers to stay inside while she spoke with them, and we were all shocked and scared. Our parents were on their honeymoon, traveling in different countries, and we had no reliable way to reach them, and my grandmother told us not to tell them anyway. I was the oldest, and I was 8 years old, and I had no idea what to do. That night I snuck onto my parents' computer and almost sent them an email, but I was afraid of ruining their honeymoon, and I did nothing. My parents found out about a month later, but by then my younger brother was already being treated like he was exaggerating. Not long after, my grandmother was kicked out of the house after another argument where she accused me of inappropriate behavior with my stepfather, when in reality we were just bonding over movies and video games, and I was 8 years old enjoying having a new father figure. The look on my face, confused and hurt because I did not even understand what she was implying, was enough for my mother to throw her out immediately. Rationally, I know it was not my fault, but I still blame myself for many parts of it, for not telling someone and for not doing more. That same brother was later diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder as a teenager, and I know his childhood played a role in that, and even now I struggle not to blame myself. Story 19. Back in March of 2010, I had just started a new job at a large retail store. I was about 4 months pregnant, and I was living with my parents because the baby's father was incarcerated. My younger brother, who was 19 at the time, had also recently moved back in due to serious mental health issues. One morning he had a bad argument with my mother, and although I cannot remember what it was about, I remember that he was very upset. We talked for a while, a real heartfelt conversation, and then I went to work. After my shift, I had an errand to run in a neighboring town and decided to stop by the house to see if my brother wanted to come with me. When I arrived, he was sitting in my father's recliner, and I sat on the couch across the room. He appeared to be asleep. My mother called and asked me to wake him up to ask him something. I called his name a few times and got no response, so I walked over to him. That was when I saw the blood covering the left side of the chair and pooling on the floor, the gun resting in his lap, and blood on his head. My brother was dead. I started screaming into the phone that he was dead, over and over, while my mother panicked and rushed home. We called emergency services and even tried to perform resuscitation. And when responders arrived, I was outside on the porch crying and screaming for them to save him, as if there was still something they could do. It is something that has stayed with me ever since and still deeply affects me. And even writing about it now feels like it just happened. We grew up together, only 2 years apart, and he was an incredible person, kind, intelligent, and always looking out for kids who had no one else. What hurts the most is how unfair it feels, that I was the reckless one, and he was the one who could not escape his inner pain. To make everything worse, later that same year in August, I lost the baby I was carrying, a little girl named Lily, almost full term due to a sudden medical emergency in the parking lot of my job. That year was one of the most devastating and painful periods my family has ever endured. Story 20. I was the only person who walked away from a New Year's Eve accident when I was 16 years old. My brother was driving the car, and even though he had not been drinking because his girlfriend would not allow it, he was driving recklessly. I had been drinking a bottle of wine and passed out in the back seat. I remember being angry about how he was driving, but not understanding why. We were chasing another car driven by a classmate of mine on unfamiliar gravel roads. The other car lost control on a corner and went into a ditch, and so did we. I woke up upside down in the car with my brother yelling at me to go get help. He and his girlfriend were trapped on the floor of the car, a 1976 Crown Victoria, and they were in a lot of pain. I somehow climbed out through the side window and made my way up and out of the ditch, which was about 25 feet below the road in a culvert. When I reached the road, I saw a light in the distance and went toward it as fast as I could. I got past several dogs, something I do not even remember doing, and made it into a house where I called emergency services. They had me look for mail to figure out where I was, and then they dispatched police and an ambulance. Afterward, I went outside to wait, and that was when it hit me and I threw up on the porch. Then I heard the screaming, loud and horrifying, sounding like it was right in front of me. At the time, I did not even know there was another car involved because I had been knocked unconscious, so I assumed the screams were coming from my brother and his girlfriend. What had actually happened was that the other car had rolled and ejected both passengers, and one of them had gone into a barbed wire fence at high speed, badly injured and screaming in pain. When the police and ambulance arrived, we went back to the crash site and could barely find our car because it was so deep in the culvert. Everyone survived, though the driver of the other car was left with one arm permanently paralyzed. I ended up with my first severe concussion and dealt with vertigo and migraines for months. In the end, we were incredibly lucky because a few more minutes and the passengers of the other car would have died from exposure, as it was New Year's Eve in the Midwest and about 10 degrees outside. I will never forget the screaming, the fear, the cold, the nerves, and the vast blackness away from the house lights. I do not go out on New Year's Eve anymore because I truly believe my luck for that night has been used up, and now I stay safe, warm, and count my blessings at the end of each year as my own personal tradition. Story 21. This past summer, I went to stay with my cousin at her house near a lake, and although we only went to the lake one day, I know I will never forget it. Everything felt normal until we were walking back to the car. I am a teenager, and my cousin looks young enough to be my age, so that context matters. As we were leaving, a man stopped us and said he was glad to see us, and that he would have stayed if he could, even though he was walking toward the lake and we were walking away. I did not think much of it at first because my cousin is a teacher, and I assumed he might be someone she knew. When we reached the parking lot, she told me she thought the interaction was strange, and that was when I realized he was just a random person. As we got to the car, a woman in an old sport utility vehicle pulled up and blocked the exit of the parking lot. She started asking us questions about the lake, and while it did not seem too strange at first, she kept repeating the same questions in slightly different ways. I became very uncomfortable and walked back to our car. My cousin followed, and once inside, she told me she had heard a man mumbling in the back seat of the vehicle, even though no one was visibly sitting there, and that the woman had tried to show her a picture of a deer. The parking lot was almost empty, with maybe 5 cars out of 50 spaces, yet the woman parked right next to us and continued talking through our window, asking the same questions again. When we made it clear that we were leaving, she walked away from the lake instead of toward it. On the drive home, I told my cousin how unsettling the whole situation felt, especially because it seemed like using a woman to approach us could have been intentional, since people tend to trust women more. When we got back to the house, we told her husband, and he agreed that something about it was not right. We ended up calling the non-emergency line so there would at least be a record in case anyone else had been harmed. Some people later told us we did not overreact, while others disagreed. But to this day, I stand by the feeling that if strangers make you uncomfortable enough to call authorities, something is wrong with how they approach people. Story 22. I moved out of my childhood home when I was 19 and moved in with my girlfriend in a different city, but I still visited my parents as often as I could, especially during holidays. When I was 21, I realized that my mother did not just have a mild drinking problem anymore, but that it had progressed into full alcoholism, and my 2 younger siblings, who still lived at home, were forced to endure her being blackout drunk every day. Eventually, my father moved out with my younger siblings, so they would not have to live through that anymore. Where I am from, it is tradition to spend Christmas Eve with family and then go out on Christmas Day, so when my older sister and I returned late from a party, we stayed at my mother's place. In the middle of the night, my sister woke me up because she heard pained moaning coming from our mother's room. And when I went downstairs and opened the bedroom door, I was met with a room covered in dried blood, with bloody handprints on the walls and my mother lying semi-conscious on the floor. She had gotten up to have a cigarette, fallen, and hit her face on the nightstand, splitting her mouth open and knocking over a glass, which shattered and caused her to cut herself repeatedly as she tried to stand back up. I had to sit with her, make sure she was breathing and not swallowing blood, and keep her as still as possible because she was so intoxicated She did not realize she was continuing to injure herself on the glass shards. It took 45 minutes for the ambulance to arrive, and even 7 years later, I can still clearly picture my mother lying there in the blood-covered room. Story 23. Last year, I watched a video showing how styrofoam peanuts can be melted in acetone, and being curious, I decided to try it myself. I was unimpressed by the result, so I made the incredibly stupid decision to take it a step further. I knew acetone was flammable, and for some reason I thought setting it on fire would be interesting. I lit a match and held it over the acetone, and it ignited instantly. I panicked because it happened so fast and I did not know how to stop it, so I tried blowing on the flame. When that did not work, I leaned over it and blew as hard as I could, putting my face directly above the fire. In an instant, the flames surged upward and engulfed my face. I screamed and ran for the fire extinguisher in the coat closet, struggled with it, and failed to use it properly, until my father managed to extinguish the fire. The aftermath was severe, with second-degree burns across my face, my eyebrows and eyelashes completely burned off, my hair smoking, and my ears and eyelids badly burned. It stung every time I blinked, and my forehead was permanently scarred. It might not sound that frightening to some people, but having acetone flames forced into your face and eyes is absolutely terrifying, and I still have an irrational fear of fire because of it. Story 24. Last summer, I was pulled into a riptide at Lake Ontario on a day with record-high waves, though at the time it was supposed to be a fun trip with friends. I had absolutely no understanding of how large bodies of water worked, did not float well at all, and did not even know which lake we were at. I stepped a little too far in and was suddenly pulled away from shore with no control, not understanding what was happening as I was dragged farther and farther out. I spent around 40 minutes fighting the current, swimming upward to avoid being pulled under, and the reality of being dragged down by the waves became more terrifying the farther out we went. A friend swam after me, which was brave but could have easily gotten them killed as well, and eventually a stranger came out on a kayak, flipped it, and gave us something to hold on to so we could stay above water. For the first half hour, I truly believed I was going to die, and only realized I would survive once the stranger helped us. Seeing waves still deeply unsettles me, and I never noticed how often they appear online until after that experience. The stranger, a man named Kevin, warned me that I would likely have nightmares and flashbacks, and at first I thought I would be fine, but after a couple of months the nightmares started. They became much less frequent after I shared my experience with a coworker who had survived something similar, and I am grateful for that. If you are ever caught in a riptide and are being pulled away from shore faster than you can swim, do not fight it directly, but swim parallel to the shore until you are out of the current and can safely make your way back to land. Story 25. Watching someone in the intensive care unit was the scariest experience of my life. It was my best friend's little sister, who was also very close to me. She was incredibly talented, loved the outdoors, and I adored her deeply. She was in a horrific accident that broke most of the bones in her body and caused a severe brain hemorrhage. And while there may have been more injuries, either my best friend or the doctors did not tell us everything to keep us from completely falling apart. One day I received a call telling me she was not going to survive and that I should come say goodbye, which was my first time ever stepping into an intensive care unit. She was lying in the bed looking like she was asleep, her face swollen, her beautiful long hair shaved and covered in bandages, and my best friend had to gently prompt me to speak because I was frozen. I told her how much I would miss her and that I would take care of her sister for her. We are Hindu, so we cremate our dead in the open, and it was its own kind of hell to hear the sobs and screams of her family as she was carried to the funeral pyre. Tradition dictates that the father lights the first flame at the mouth when the deceased is unmarried, and watching someone you love lying on a bed of wooden flowers, ready to leave this world, was devastating and left me shaken for days. Later, my best friend told me the truth, that there had never been any hope of survival, that her injuries were catastrophic and she would never have regained consciousness, and that by the time I said goodbye, she was already gone, with the machines only giving the appearance of sleep. It terrified me to realize I had been talking to her, hoping she could somehow hear me, when her consciousness had already ceased to exist, leaving only a shell behind. It made me wonder when a person truly stops being there, My best friend was the bravest person I have ever known, carrying the weight of all that knowledge alone and protecting the rest of us until she felt we were strong enough to hear it. And wherever you are, I love you so much. Story 26. This is a long story that I have never fully told before, but I grew up with my great-grandmother as my main parent figure because my biological mother was very young and believed this was best for me. About a year after we moved from Mexico to the United States, when I was around 5 or 6, my great-grandmother suffered a serious medical episode, and her own daughter took us in before eventually forcing her out into her ex-husband's house. On Christmas Eve, my great-grandmother and I were alone in that miserable house with no celebration, while my aunt spent the holiday with her daughters and boyfriend. My great-grandmother decided to clean the bathroom because of black mold between the tiles, and I remember us both going inside together. The space tiny, barely fitting a tub, a sink, and a toilet. She closed and locked the door, turned toward the tub, and suddenly stopped, and I instantly felt panic. She began to fall backward, and I remember thinking that if I did not catch her, she would hit her head, so somehow I managed to catch her and lower her to the floor, terrified and sobbing so hard I could barely see. She lost consciousness and came to briefly while I begged her to wake up, to take us to bed, to hold me and make everything okay. For hours I shifted her position so she would not be hurt by the door and cried, until I finally managed to get the door open. Eventually an adult was reached by phone, and the fire department arrived to find a 6-year-old child holding her great-grandmother's head in her lap and crying. Days later we learned she was paralyzed on one side of her body, and my hatred for my aunt began there. Over the years I watched my great-grandmother suffer while my aunt screamed at her and treated her like a burden, and eventually my cousins left, abandoning us with her. Years later, when I was about 8, I was alone with my great-grandmother, when she suddenly began convulsing in bed, and not knowing what was happening, I ran into the street until I found someone who could call for help. That woman stayed with me and kept me calm until help arrived. These are only some of the worst memories, but they shaped me deeply, and even now I live with the lasting effects of being a child who had to survive adult horrors alone, protecting the only person who ever truly loved me. Story 27. When I was a sophomore in college, I got a bug bite that turned into a flesh-eating disease. I was bitten on January 3rd at a friend's house in South Phoenix and did not think much of it at first, assuming it was a normal bug bite. It was on my back left side, just behind my armpit. On my 21st birthday, January 8th, I was with my sisters getting ready to go out when they took a picture of it because it looked strange. The small bump had spread to about the size of a dime, red in the middle with flaky dead skin on the outside, and it did not hurt or sting, it just looked wrong. We put hydrocortisone on it and went out. 1 week later, I went to urgent care because it had grown to the size of a $50, still perfectly round but clearly spreading. The nurse prescribed antibiotics to treat an infection and sent me home. That seemed to work and cleared it up for a few weeks, but late in February, I felt an itch closer to my armpit that seemed off. When I looked in the mirror, the spot was back, more red and irritated, so my mom called the dermatologist and we went a week later. By then it was no longer perfectly round, and it was not just one spot but 3, spreading quickly. The doctor could not immediately identify what it was, ran multiple tests, and said it was most likely a staph infection. He prescribed a topical ointment and very strong antibiotics, which made me extremely nauseous. But after 6 weeks, the infection on my back cleared. By April, school was winding down, and I was preparing for a study abroad trip to Italy, where I would be gone for 3 months. Less than a week after stopping the antibiotics, I developed another spot on the lower part of my armpit. I scheduled an appointment, but my doctor could not see me for a week, and in that time the spot turned into a severe rash under my armpit that spread, burned, and peeled my skin every time I moved. The doctor performed a skin punch biopsy and consulted with the Centers for Disease Control, then instructed me to take bleach baths 3 times a week and destroy all clothing I had worn during that period. I did everything asked because I just wanted my skin back and to be able to put my arm down. The rash spread toward my chest and the back of my arm and became so painful I could barely sleep. As a last effort, the doctors put me on another antibiotic, which made me sick every time I took it. But combined with the bleach baths and replacing my clothes, it finally worked. I had my doctor prescribe an extra course for when I was in Europe, so I could keep it under control until I returned. That medication ultimately worked, leaving me with scars from the infection and biopsies. But 5 years later, I have had no recurrence. To this day, neither my dermatologist nor the specialist he consulted has been able to identify what caused it or why it kept returning. Story 28. I love my parents, but I am still angry that they did not believe me when I told them what happened. To explain the situation clearly, my bedroom had a door that led directly outside to the side of the house because half of our garage had been converted into a bedroom. I had 3 doors in that room, one to the garage, one outside, and one into the den, and the outside door was right at the foot of my bed. During the summer, I would leave that door open for sunlight because there were no windows, and sometimes I forgot to deadbolt it. One night when I was about 13, I was sitting on my bed on the computer with the bedroom light on and no music playing. Suddenly, I heard a faint scratching noise near the top of the outside door. I got off the bed and pressed my ear against it, initially thinking it might be a bush brushing against the door. But then I realized the sound was deliberate, and I could hear breathing. With my ear still against the door, I looked down and saw that the door was unlocked. I should have locked it, but I froze, realizing I was only inches away from someone and wanting to put distance between us. It also hit me that they did not know the door was unlocked, which meant they were trying to force their way in. Without taking my eyes off the door, I slowly backed away into the den, carefully stepping around recently laid tiles so I would not make noise. I reached the stairs and sat quietly listening. After a few seconds, the door opened. I ran to the second set of stairs leading upstairs and listened again, then heard a tile clank as the person walked through my room. Instead of going to my parents', I ran into my little brother's room, locked the door, and stayed there the rest of the night, hoping the intruder would leave. The next morning, I went into my room and saw leaves and dirt on the floor by the door, but everything else was untouched, including my computer. It became clear that nothing had been stolen, and the realization that they had been there for me was chilling. 3 nights later, someone tried to kick down the same door, likely thinking it had been weakened. When I told my parents, they insisted it was probably a small animal scratching at the door, and that dismissal has stayed with me ever since. Story 29. When I was 5 years old, I was playing a computer game with my dad when we both thought we smelled smoke. We quickly checked around the computer, and since this was back in 1999, when computers often ran hot, we did not think much of it and kept playing for about another half hour. Then my mother and brothers came home, and my mom told me it was time for bed and that she was going to get my pajamas. She walked out of the living room and within 5 seconds ran back in screaming at my dad. I do not remember everything clearly after that, but my parents scooped me and my older brothers up and rushed us into the car across the road. My bedroom was completely on fire. My parents were frantically trying to figure out what to do, shutting doors, grabbing important photos, and running to neighbors for a hose and to call the fire department. An off-duty volunteer firefighter happened to drive by just after finishing his shift and had a large hose in his van. And once the fire department arrived, we were taken away. A few days later, I was brought back to see the damage, and everything I owned, everything I loved, including photo albums my parents had stored in my wardrobe, was burned black and crumpled. We later learned the fire was caused by a bedroom fan we had bought at a garage sale, whose faulty wiring had sparked and caught fire. Story 30. I was driving on the freeway on my way to work when I took my eyes off the road for just a second to change a compact disc. When I looked back up, there was a truck driving the wrong way down the freeway. It skidded along the median and came straight toward me, and I yanked the steering wheel and spun off the side of the road. After my car came to a stop, I feel like I blacked out or mentally disappeared for a moment. When I got out of my car to see what had happened, I realized the truck had slammed head-on into the car that had been behind me. The man in that car was dead, and the injuries were horrific. I went into shock and tried to perform chest compressions on him, even though there was nothing that could be done, and other drivers had to pull me away while emergency responders gave me medication to calm me down. The driver of the truck crashed through a chain-link fence and tried to run, but was chased down and restrained by witnesses. He was extremely intoxicated, only 24 years old, and this was his 3rd offense for driving under the influence. It took months of therapy before I could drive on the freeway again, forcing me to take long back roads every day. And even now, I can have panic attacks as a passenger if a driver follows another car too closely. To this day, I am only truly comfortable being a passenger when the driver is one of three people I deeply trust: my father, my brother, or my partner. Story 31. This happened to my son when he was 2 years old. My husband was away on a trip with his father, so my son and I were staying overnight at my in-laws' house, and his sister, who was 19 at the time, was also home from school. They lived in a 2-story, 3-bedroom townhouse, with my sister-in-law asleep in her room, my mother-in-law asleep in hers, and my son sleeping in his uncle's room since he was not home. I was downstairs watching television because I could not fall asleep, and it got very late, somewhere around 2 in the morning, when I started hearing a faint background noise. At first, I thought it was coming from the television, but when I paused it, I realized it was crying, and I knew my son must have woken up. I rushed upstairs and could hear him crying but could not see him, which immediately made me panic, until I noticed a pile of blankets next to the wall moving. He had fallen into the gap between the bed and the wall, which could not sit flush because of the low windowsill. When I uncovered him, I saw that he was almost completely upside down, and that was the moment that terrified me. I calmed him down, took him downstairs, and he slept in my arms while I stayed awake the rest of the night, replaying every possible outcome in my head. My sister-in-law and mother-in-law never woke up and had no idea anything had happened the next morning. And all I could think was, what if I had fallen asleep on the couch? Or what if the television had been a little louder? He could have been stuck there for hours, terrified and crying, and something truly awful could have happened. He has never slept alone in that bed since. Story 32. I was a newly licensed and fairly inexperienced driver, heading home late one night with a friend after leaving another friend's house in a more affluent neighborhood. At a yield sign, I waited for a pickup truck to go, and I honestly do not remember or care who technically had the right of way, but they did not move at all. After about 30 seconds, I decided to pull out, and that was when they started following me, turning on their high beams, tailgating me, and speeding up the more I tried to get away in my unreliable car. I was running out of flashing yellow intersections, and my friend kept telling me not to drive to his house because he did not want this person knowing where either of us lived. I do not even remember if I ran a red light or two at that point. Eventually, I started to lose control of my wide vehicle, my tires scraping the curb as I went through a U-turn, and only then did the driver finally back off and take the turn away from us. Fueled by adrenaline and anger, I stupidly turned on my interior lights just so they could see me gesture at them. After that, I was shaken and apologetic when I dropped my friend off. When I got home, my mother caught me coming in, and as I tried to explain what happened, I suddenly snapped and yelled about how angry I was, to the point that she had to physically hold me back before I broke down, shaking and crying. A year later, after a terrible day at work, I caught myself tailgating someone who had cut me off and stopped when I realized I was becoming exactly like that pickup driver. 5 years after that, a coworker jokingly suggested racing my newer vehicle, and I reacted with intense anger, threatening him and shaking while speaking, even though part of me did not want to say any of it. We are fine now, but it made me wonder if I will ever fully outgrow that fear and insecurity. I still think about what made that driver chase me that night, whether he was having a bad day, felt threatened himself, or simply enjoyed it. But whatever the reason, it left me with lasting anxiety, a deep distrust of certain vehicles on the road, and a fear of quiet neighborhoods that rivals any dark alley. Story 33. When I was 12, I was at home with my mom and my 4-year-old brother when we heard a loud crash that shook the entire house. At the time, there was a lot of talk about the New Madrid fault line, so we honestly thought it might have been an earthquake. Before my mom even fully reached the door, a young boy came running up onto our porch, begging for help. 2 vehicles filled with high school students had just left homecoming and decided to race down the road we lived on, not realizing that right by our house there was a concrete culvert in a slight curve. One of the vehicles hit the culvert, went airborne, and slammed directly into a tree in our front yard. My mom rushed outside with blankets and washcloths while I stayed inside with my brother, but I could hear the screaming and wailing from outside. My mom later told me she thought the front seat passenger was already gone, so she went to the driver first, who was moaning in pain, but then she heard the passenger making gurgling sounds. She went back to him and gently held his head up because he was choking on his own blood, cradling him and praying while emergency help was on the way. She said that when she held his head, it felt like rice cereal under her hands.